Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to take you through iNACOL's brand spanking new framework for blended teaching competencies. The blended teaching competencies are something that iNACOL has created to serve as kind of a guiding framework, similar to the Common Core or Essential Standards, if you will, for us as teachers to use to ensure that we're succeeding in implementing the blended learning framework within our classrooms. Before, blended learning was a concept that was, much talked about and widely accepted, but there wasn't really a guiding document to help facilitate effective implementation of that framework. So here we have before us a copy of the infographic that kind of explains each part of the framework for us. So this is split into a few different domains. We'll get into those in more detail in just a minute, but just to take you through the layers, the first is mindsets. That's the outermost layer. The mindsets that blended learning seeks to accomplish in our classroom is first to foster a new vision for teaching and learning in our classrooms. Blended learning, again, is about taking student ownership of learning and putting accountability on the student in an age where student accountability is decreasing much more quickly than it has ever before, in terms of student ownership of their own learning. And then the second one is orientation toward change and improvement. The blended learning framework is something so revolutionary for our 21st century classrooms that continuing to use that framework and others like it that may develop in the future are what essentially are going to transform our practices as educators. Okay, the middle, if you will, ring here is called qualities. The qualities of an effective blended learning teacher are grit, transparency, and collaboration. So that grit is making sure that you set aggressive goals for yourself and work toward achieving them in this framework. Transparency is being very clear about your goals, and collaboration is making sure that you bring other colleagues in to help you achieve those goals as well. Blended learning is a wonderful pedagogical tool to be used for collaboration because you can film screencasts and create lessons in cooperation with other teachers, and you can actually facilitate the spread of blended learning from one person to multiple classrooms. And then finally, the skills, the innermost layer. This part is split into two different modalities. One of them is adaptive. So that adaptive skill set for a blended learning teacher is really all about, learning from mistakes, especially with early adopters in the blended learning framework. You really have to think about each lesson, each day, were my students engaged during that screencast? How was I most effectively able to best use the time that I had to monitor students while the screencast was playing, to be able to facilitate a learning experience by bringing homework or other activities into the classroom, by decreasing the amount of instructional time that I'm talking, things like that. And then taking those reflections and using them to continuously improve and innovate your practices. And then finally, communication is the best, or the best for last, adaptive skill that we have. Then technical skills on the other side here, talking about best practices using this framework, instructional strategies that you can specifically use. So as I mentioned earlier, creating screencasts for students is a part of the blended learning framework, but just videotaping yourself speaking is not necessarily going to be as effective as if you bring in a whiteboard with information on it that you go over with students as you are talking with the webcam, or by doing like I am right now and providing you with a tangible thing to look at as a frame of reference for our conversation, just as you would in a classroom if you're projecting something and discussing it, or completing math problems with your students in real time using a Web 2.0 tool. Just do those things during the screencasts, And that's an example of an effective instructional strategy as a blended learning teacher. Third technical skill is management of blended learning experience. I cannot stress enough how critical it is that you focus on always becoming better. Never accept that you are an effective blended learning teacher, because if you do that, you're not only an injustice to your own growth, but you're also a roadblock to the growth of your students. And then finally, instructional tools. So those are those Web 2.0 tools that we keep talking about as educators, and making sure that you are using those correctly and effectively through implementation via the TPACK framework or the SAMR framework. Okay, so the competencies themselves do look sort of like the Common Core and Essential Standards. Domain number 1, mindsets. You can see here they're splitting the competencies and standards under those specific competencies in the domains themselves. So the first mindsets that we talked about, the new vision for teaching and learning, was the first competency. You can see that an example of the first standard is the shift from teacher-led instruction to student-centered learning, which is exactly what I was discussing with you, for the purposes of meeting individual needs and fostering engagement and motivation. Domain 2, grit, engage in deliberate practice and persevere toward ambitious long-term educational and professional goals. Domain 3, the first competency of reflection, continuously take note of what is or isn't working via student-level data, tech applications, pedagogical strategies, supervisor feedback, and identify a plan of action. And then finally, technical skills. Blended teachers should, as far as data practices go, use qualitative and quantitative data to understand individual skills, gaps, strengths, weaknesses, interests, and aspirations of each student, and use that information to personalize learning experiences. One final note on this competency, you may have noticed that it was misspelled as date practices in the framework above. The data that you can get from a blended learning framework or pedagogy in your classroom is incredible. There are several formative and summative assessment tools that will collect data and provide it for you in a way that allows you to reflect almost instantaneously on your students' performance in class. For example, there is a tool called Kahoot. GetKahoot.com is the address for that tool. And using that tool in the classroom allows you instantaneously to gather student feedback on the number of students in your class who answered a one way or another, and to be able to have that critical discussion right in the moment about why your students chose the answer that they did, and explain why the correct answer was indeed the correct answer. We have several tools just like Kahoot, Socrative, Poll Everywhere, and tools like that that are really critical in ensuring student success in the classroom. And that is essentially an overview of the iNACOL Blended Learning Competencies for Teachers.